Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today. This is Brian Lewandowski, and today with me I have JT McMahon, one of our civil application engineers. He's going to be leading you through today's webinar. It's a Civil 3D Part Builder Introduction, so we're not going to get into anything real advanced, but a nice introduction on concepts and so forth. Before we get started, just a couple items. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to submit those. We will address those as they're appropriate and as we have time for them. If we don't get to them during the webinar, we will get back to you through email or a phone call afterwards. As always, we are recording this and we'll post this to our CTC YouTube channel, so feel free to check that out or pass that around your coworkers after the fact. And finally, there will be a brief survey after this. We encourage you guys to fill that out, give us ideas for new topics, new webinars, and any feedback about how we did today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to JT, and he's going to walk you through a part builder intro.
Thank you, Brian. So we'll be going over part builder today, and we'll actually spend all of our time in part builder itself. It's kind of an overview of part builder. What is part builder? What does it do? Part builder is the environment in which the parts are created, parts being pipes and structures. That's where the root figures themselves are defined. That's where they're built. We're going to go kind of over a little bit of an overview of part builder. Once we kind of get in there, we can kind of see it and go over a little bit of the environment itself. Then we'll go through and we'll define the part, kind of tell it what type of part it is. Is it a junction structure, or what's going on, what type of pipe it would also be in there. We'll be doing a structure today. We'll create work planes and profiles. Some of this terminology might be a little bit foreign if you haven't used part builder yourself yet. Profiles especially, it's not something that is anything like profiles that are out in your typical civil world. Doesn't have to do anything with an alignment or anything like that. So one thing that I would say, just kind of keep in mind when it comes to part builder, if you want to have more of an understanding of part builder, and you don't really have any understanding, do know that it's really worth forgetting most of what you know about CAD. It's its own environment, and everything's not everything, but most things are done differently from within part builder. So it's kind of just start fresh if you want to tackle learning part builder. Would be my top recommendation. So after doing the work planes and the profiles, we will define the profiles. And again, that'll make more sense to you, and we'll use parameters and constraints to do that. And then we'll set our parameter values at the end. That ends up being kind of one of the big translations back to civil, as far as defining your wall thickness or your sump, or the size of the rim, as it were, the size of the pipe would be another place that those would be used. So let's jump into part builder. One of the quick ways to get into part builder, so I just have an open blank drawing here. If I'm on my home tab, I'll go under the create design. I can jump right into part builder. The first thing I would do is I'd pick whether or not I'm trying to either build or edit a pipe or a structure. For this point, I will do a structure. Then you have some already predefined. This is kind of the out-of-the-box catalog parts, part catalogs that are in here. Simple shapes is one that I work on. You can create your own if you want to. You could create a new chapter to put in your custom parts. And then if you wanted to edit a part, you would just click on the part itself. You would go to modify part sizes here. I'm going to go and click on the button on the left here, which is just new part. The name and the description, oftentimes you'll see that they're the same. Sometimes you'll see that they're different. When you fill out the name, and then you click into the description field, for that reason it automatically generates what you had for the name. I'm going to leave them the same here for this. If you find later that that's something you want to change, you can change it later, and then as you get more comfortable with it, you'll have an idea of how you want to name your parts. So I do that, I click on OK, and then I wait for Part Builder to load up here. One interesting thing is that it says Drawing 3, but in here it says New Part. That's what I called my part. If I click under New, or my part configuration, again it says New Part. This Drawing 3 updates as soon as I save the part. Although it's not validated yet because I haven't added anything in there. It lets me know that as I save it as well. That's kind of down here. We'll get to that a little bit here. So under part configuration, this is a one-time deal. First time you create it, or maybe when you first are looking at a part that you're trying to edit, or trying to look at maybe a part that you don't like some of the properties of. This is where you're going to look in to see kind of the overview. This is the larger, the more macro scale, what is this part? It's a structure. I can't change that. It just kind of tells me what it is. Undefined part type here. I can set this to be a junction structure. We have a few different structure types. Depending on which one I pick here, some of my settings and some of the things that will be displayed later will be specific to those. So it doesn't just give you everything. It's nice that it trims it down to what would be necessary for each one. This is a modifier that you can, it says undefined here, and there aren't any default ones. You can set this to sort through parts. So you could give parts their own, just another way, I guess, to sort parts and view them. And then we have undefined bounded shapes. So again, here this is going to be another area where you're going to want to set this to the type of structure or pipe, as it were, that you want to create. We're going to be doing a cylinder part here that I'm going to build just for the sake of time. Boxes get a little bit more complicated, but a lot of the same concepts that I'll be going over today will apply. So hopefully you'll get a kind of a good understanding of how those work. So now we got this kind of set up, and I'll actually just minimize that because it's a one-time deal. We have it set up correctly. We're not going to need to go back to it, ideally. Now we can get into modeling. Work planes. It comes in pretty nice order as far as what you're going to need to pay attention to. At least in the order that you're going to need to pay attention to them, not necessarily importance, but how you first create it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a work plane. And I'm going to create a top work plane. When it comes to structures, I'm almost always using the top first. I'm going to design top down. That's where my surface is, and then we're going to go under the ground from there. I like to call it the rim, maybe rim plane if you prefer. You can let that, and then so we click on that and displays this yellow box. What is this yellow box? It's a plane. It says now, I'm seeing a structure. So that this is just the yellow box that shows up here is really just a physical representation for the entire plane. It is indeed a two-dimensional plane. It's infinite in its size. As I rotate there, you can see that it's just two-dimensional. Snap back to top here. So under our work plane, we're going to want to add in a profile. So a profile, as I hover over this, you could have different types of shapes, and you could have a custom one that you had drawn from other pieces of geometry. I don't necessarily recommend defining it with your own geometry if you can avoid it. For now, as I said, we're going to just kind of do something circular. I'm going to get mine set up right in the middle here just because I like to work in the middle of my work plane. You can work completely outside of this yellow box if you prefer not to see it. I find it a little bit easier just to see the plane I'm in. I can specify a radius here, and I'm just going to click anywhere. and just let that circle appear at what is currently a random radius and random diameter, as it's probably better to think in terms of diameter when it comes to circles while you're in Part Builder. I'm going to add another piece of geometry. I'm going to add a point. The point I can pick to be anywhere right now because I'm actually going to define this point in a minute. I'm going to add in a dimension. So I want to dimension my diameter. And if you actually look here in our command line, if you can kind of see what it's displaying, it's good to pay attention to this when you're trying to build parts. It says that it's under constrained by 2 dimensions right now. And so when I add this, if you watch, when I add this diameter, I click on the profile that I want to add it to, and then and pay attention when you click on the spot of this, that's a one-time deal. I don't get to move this now later on. So do put it somewhere that's going to be nice on your screen, and it will move kind of with the circle if I redefine it. But if you see what happened down here, it said now under constrained by 1 dimension. So I added this, and this is now something that will be down in our parameters that we'll be able to see later. But the important thing to know is that this circle now has a dimension for its size. Before, it didn't really. It was just kind of random and didn't know what it was. It was kind of a loose, and it was floating. You could kind of think of it that way as well. And if I want to actually change my circle here, I have to set the value of that diameter to what I wanted it to be. So if I want this to have 27, and again, everything in Part Builder, I should say, it was going to be in inches. That's kind of an important thing to know. Get used to thinking in inches when you're in Part Builder. So I set that to 27 inches. You can see that my circle changed with it. That's because it is defining the circle. The circle isn't defining what's labeled here. This is a dimension. The dimension is defining the circle. Hopefully you're already starting to see here kind of why Part Builder is it's a whole new way of thinking. That's just the opposite of what you'd expect coming from a Civil 3D background when you're in your typical drawing space. Part Builder, it's backwards in some ways, and it's certainly just different. So I still have that 1 dimension that I still need to use to define my part. Part isn't quite good yet. I'm going to add 1 more piece here to this profile. And this time I'm going to add a constraint. So it says, under constrained by dimensions, constraints will also work. They also fall under that umbrella. I'm going to add 1 to be concentric. So this is why I created this point earlier. Now I'm going to have my circle be concentric to a point, and I can pick on these 2 in either order, and as you can see, it snapped my point to the middle of the circle. And now, if you look down again in the command line, it says right number of dimensions. This says part family validation failed, but if I go and click on the stoplight up here to validate my part, you can see that it's now validated. That's something that's a static kind of connection, not dynamic. You run validation, and it looks at the part and says whether or not it's good. And at this point, I'll go ahead and just save the family. Okay, so now we've created our rim, our surface, all in the 2 dimensions of the rim plane. If I hover here and kind of pull off of that top view, you can see that everything we've done is it's all in 1 flat space. This is where we'll get to adding a modifier. I'm going to add an extrusion. There's a few different things in here. Some of it gets a bit more complicated. I'm just going to deal with extrusions for this webinar today, for time's sake. So I add an extrusion. I have to select a profile. There's only 1, but that's the one that I want. I have 2 options, mid-plane or blind. I think blind's a little bit of a kind of an interesting term that they picked, but blind just means go 1 direction from the profile. Mid-plane, with this being 1, it would go 1 inch from both sides of the profile, both up and down. Again, I want to work top down, so I want this to be blind, and I want to flip it. which means simply that I want it to go the downward direction as opposed to going up. Kind of like putting a negative symbol on there. I'm going to have it go down 6 inches. Okay, and then, so there you can see already it's extruded it down. This is kind of where we're getting into the 3D modeling of the part. At the same time as I did that, these 3 blue rings, one around that point, which is the middle, concentric to my circle, but these 3 blue rings appeared. And at the same time, if you happen to notice, the auto layout data field became populated with auto layout data. This is going to be the insertion point of your structure, or of your part, as it were. So I want to select the placement point here. You could leave all 3 in the middle there if you wanted. I myself prefer to just kind of show that one spot at the top in the middle of my room. I think that's just a nice way to display it. And I have these 6 inches here. For the case of this part, I'm going to design it such that these 6 inches would stay the same. I could add in a model dimension if that were something that we're going to change, and we'll get into that just in a minute. But for the sake of this part, I'm going to say that that's something that stays a consistent 6 inches. Now what I want to do is create another plane. I want to create another piece of structure down here. And I need to define another plane for that shape. I right-click on my work planes here and add a work plane. This work plane is going to be an offset work plane. It's going to be offset from my top work plane. We can call this one barrel plane. And it's going to ask me to specify the reference work plane. There's only one. I'll go ahead and click on that work plane. This offset's a little bit of a tricky thing to kind of watch how it's being displayed. It's kind of like an offset. This is maybe one of the few things that you could apply your civil knowledge towards. Is you're trying to see which side of it to offset. I want to offset this 6 inches below. I'll just type in 6 there once I have it on the correct side. And you can see I've created a work plane that's kind of on the same level as the bottom of the other piece that I'd created. Although that piece, do keep in mind, was not defined in that work plane. In fact, there's nothing currently defined in the work plane. What you're going to change here. And this time, instead of adding the circle first, I want to actually add the point, because I'm able to add a point that references another point by clicking on point and reference there. And I just go find a point in a different profile, or in a different work plane, as it were. That way I can reference in between the two. It's a fairly common thing to use. It's kind of, it's a way to connect the two. It's, if I have it up here and I want to kind of use that same spot in the structure down below, that's how you would go about doing it, is you'd use that, reference the point, and then you could go from there. Then I'm going to add another profile, the circle that'll be the top of my barrel. And as we showed earlier, we're going to end up constraining this around that point anyways. This time, instead of the point moving to the circle will move to the point. So again, I've created this just with a random radius, random diameter, because I'll define that by the dimension later on. So right away, I'm going to add that constraint to be concentric. It knows that that point can't move because this point is referencing the one above it. It won't move to where the circle is. It has to stay where it is. Still under constrained by one dimension. Once again, it's an important thing to watch, especially when you get to rectangles, because it's going to be more than 2 dimensions if you are indeed using them or your own custom shape. This is a big key to let you know whether or not your part is going to fail. That's, it's one of the telltale signs. If you're under defined, then it's just your part's going to be no good. I'll add a dimension here, and once again we'll use diameter as our dimension. And then I'm going to pick a similar position to the one before, just for simplicity's sake. I want to modify that dimension. So I'll click on set value there, and it asks me to pick the dimension. I can actually pick either one at this point. I'll pick the one that I want to define, and we'll set this to be 48 inches. The next step here is going to be, again, the next step here is going to again be to add an extrusion from this profile. So I'm going to add an additional extrusion. This time we'll actually get another option to do mid-plane. Plane instead of mid-plane. And then, so you could extrude this from one plane to another. We only have 2 planes here, and it's not something that I'm going to end up using, but that is another option out there if that's how you decide to define your parts. When it comes to defining parts, creativity is one of the things that can be really great about it. You can go about building these things in a lot of different ways and how they reference each other. But for this barrel here, I'm going to do blind again. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to set a distance here for how I want it to show. I'm going to have it go down 2 feet. But again, we're think in terms of inches, so I'll be going down 24 inches. And you can see it's created kind of a small barrel here at 48 inches round and 2 feet deep. This time I am going to add a model dimension, because this is I know that my barrel here is something that I'm going to want to have different values. I don't want this to be always 6 inches. I want this to be what the structure demands for out in the field. So I'm going to add a model dimension. So again, this isn't something that's constrained underneath the profile, but this is a model dimension of an extrusion. So it's a little bit different. And you'll notice here it's got a kind of a different folder structure on the location of that. And you pick it, and it always kind of comes in a little bit difficult to read. It says LEN B1. It looks like I got 24, which is what it should say as I defined it there. It doesn't come in nice and easy to read, but that's what it says. So far, so good. I've got some of the key pieces as far as the structure kind of being built. I'm actually not going to really spend any more time here in the model part. I'm going to spend the rest of my time over in the parameters. You have model parameters and size parameters. It's kind of a difficult relationship to understand at first. It's something that you gotta use I would say multiple times typically before you get a real good understanding of the connection in between model and size parameters. But know that model parameters is kind of a starting place for generating size parameters, and size parameters end up being what you're going to see and what you're going to use back in Civil. So these are a good starting point, and sometimes how you define these will end up defining the size parameter. You'll see that a lot of these, it's the same list in a lot of ways. Boundary D1, body D1 down here. They're in both places. I'm going to start off by giving a value to all of my model parameters. I don't want to see anything to be 0. So even if it's floor thickness, and maybe floor thickness isn't something that I like to use, don't leave it at 0. Even if you plan on setting it back to 0 later, it's always good advice to set these to be something. In model parameters, again, it's not really as much what affects what you see in your drawing. That'll be under size parameters, and we'll get to that. The structure diameter, So instead of typing this in, perhaps I could have this use the variable, and I could use my diameter, either one depending on how I wanted to display that. If I use body diameter 2, it'll be that 48 inch. It'll be displaying as a 48 inch for the barrel, the diameter of that barrel. My structure height, I could have calculate once again off of my length. That was the model dimension. That was the height here, and then I could add 6 inches onto it for the distance in between my work planes here, and the distance of this top piece of the structure. And so that's going to calculate it. It sees my 24 inches and it just adds on that 6. You can see how that works in the value here. I could set rim to sump to be the same thing if I wanted, or if I had sump and I wanted sump to be something that was defined separately, I could do that. If I wanted to custom type in a sump each time, I could have it do that through my equation. For this example, I'm just going to allow that to be the same as my structure height. Vertical pipe clearance, again, if it's not something that you want to, maybe you want to use it, you have a defined value you know that you want here. Maybe not. I'm going to set mine to be 6 inches and my wall thickness to 2 inches. I don't plan on using it typically, but don't leave it at 0. That's my advice to you. The model parameters, some of this has now affected my size parameters. Size parameters are what you probably have to pay the most attention to when it comes to how you want to manipulate your part back in Civil. It's good to kind of go in here, start off in the parameter configuration view as opposed to values or calculations. That's where you'll edit them later, but it's kind of hard, especially when you're first learning this stuff. What is BD1 or BDY D1? What is that? What's going on there? What's WTH? That's wall thickness. FTH is floor thickness. You can kind of see what they are here. And then when you go over to these other areas, again, you won't necessarily get the full description. So it's kind of, what do I want to edit? And where do I go to edit that? You'll see a lot of these are constants. Some of them are calculations based on how we defined them, and model parameters. There's a few different ways. If it's a calculation, it's going to stay as a calculation. A lot of times, some of these, I guess, you can use a table as well, but some of them will say through our model parameters, that's a calculation, so you can't change that through here. I'd have to go redefine it through model parameters if indeed it was an accident or something that I wanted to change through here. So for the height, that was my length B1. I don't want that to be a constant. I don't want that always to be 2 feet, as we said earlier. I want this to be a range. So if I set that to range, and it didn't update there, but if I come over here to length, and I get this little edit, you can see that it is indeed a range. It's not a constant, and I can change it. So I can allow this to be a minimum value. Let's say just a foot, and then you can set a maximum. This is something that I recommend setting very large, unless you know that people are creating structures that are bigger than they ought to be, and you have something definite in mind. Otherwise, I'll just use a large, 50,000 is going to be enough inches, and then we're going to have a structure bigger than that. Then where do I want it to come in as a default? 24 is kind of what I had picked earlier. That's fine. Somebody did kind of go in and ask a question to talk a little bit about custom model parameters. So I can go and I can add new parameters. Say I wanted something for the sump to be in here, and I wanted a calculation. I wanted to create a new one. We'll call it sump. And I could either have I could do equation, or I could just kind of type in here 24 and have it be 24 inches. So this way I would always have a 2 foot I could then use this to define kind of how my structure is going to behave, and I could always have a 2-foot sump on this structure if that's what I wanted to do. That's not something that I'm interested in for this example, but do know that you can add in model parameters. You can kind of custom ones to define things. And actually you can add different size parameters as well. As far as which ones you can add, this is something that will depend upon the structure that you've built so far. So there's a bunch of different things, different constants that it would allow me to define that it doesn't necessarily need. It only gives you what you need, or at least it thinks that you need to define the part. You could add other things. I'm not using a cone here, but I could add a cone height. I could add a lot of different things in. And if you find that these don't define the default ones don't define everything that you want to be able to edit in your part, this is where you would go to look for that. Again, for the sake of time, we're not going to go too much into that. It does get a bit more complicated as far as how many of those would you want to look at. But yeah, now that actually I have the length, my height to be something that's variable, it's not going to always be that 24. That's what we defined here. I'm pretty happy with the way that my part is. One of the other things that might be common that people would possibly want is to set this diameter here to be a list of items. And then when I come over, I would want to create a list that would be something that you'd be able to pick over in Civil. So instead of only being able to use 48-inch, I could add 60. So again, that body diameter 1 was something that we customized as a dimension. So it'll change that 48 to a 60, and it'll change the size of my structure. So that's something that I could add through here. One other common one that I do see is floor thickness. I see people wanting a different floor thickness. You could set this also to be a list and come in and customize your floor thickness, the list of things for floor thickness. Could have my 2 in there, and I could have it 0. So that way I could set my floor thickness to be 0 if that was something that was causing my structures in the profile back in Civil to display funny. That's pretty much what I have here for this demonstration. If you have some more questions, maybe you can get them in.